They told Robert Redford the role would destroy his career. The studio wanted to cut the silence. In one scene, they filmed it in weather so brutal, the crew thought they'd lose fingers. These are 20 weird facts about Jeremiah Johnson. And the bonus? A real mountain man showed up on set and wouldn't leave until they got it right. Head for the mountains. This story runs deep and cold. Before there was a script, there was a book nobody wanted to film. Director Sidney Pollack discovered Mountain Man by Vardis Fisher, buried in a pile of rejected properties at Warner Brothers. The novel was dark, violent, and uncompromising. A revenge tale about a man who wages war against an entire Native American tribe after they kill his family. Studios had passed on it for years. Too bleak, they said. Too uncommercial. No happy ending. But Pollack saw something else. He saw a myth. An American fable about a man becoming something more than human in the wilderness. He brought it to Robert Redford, who'd just come off Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Redford was Hollywood's golden boy, America's sweetheart with perfect hair and a smile that sold tickets. The studio begged him not to do it. They said playing a grimy, blood-soaked mountain man would kill his image. Redford didn't blink. He wanted the role precisely because it was the opposite of everything he'd done before. No charm, no wit, just survival. And when filming started in the Utah mountains, something changed. The cold got into his bones. The silence shaped his performance. And Robert Redford stopped being a movie star. He became Jeremiah Johnson. Most films hire consultants for authenticity. Jeremiah Johnson hired a ghost. His name was John Liver-Eating Johnson, the real mountain man who inspired the character, and he'd been dead for 70 years. But his legend hadn't died with him. Stories about Johnson spread through the Rockies like wildfire. How he ate the livers of Crow warriors who killed his wife. How he survived winters that would break lesser men. How he walked alone for decades, speaking to no one, becoming something between man and myth. The production team tracked down every scrap of documentation they could find. Old journals, newspaper accounts, folk songs passed down through generations. What they discovered was even stranger than fiction. The real Johnson had been a deserter, a gold prospector, a scout, and eventually a town marshal who died quietly in a veteran's home. But the legend was immortal. Sidney Pollack didn't want to make a biopic. He wanted to capture the myth itself. So they stripped away the revenge plot from the original novel and replaced it with something simpler and more profound. A man learning to exist in a world that doesn't care if he lives or dies. The film became less about violence and more about silence, space, and transformation. And somehow, in doing so, they got closer to the truth of who John Johnson really was. Robert Redford prepared for the role like he was preparing for war. He spent weeks before filming living in the mountains, learning to skin animals, set traps, and start fires without matches. He grew his hair long, stopped shaving, and let his hands crack and bleed from the cold. But there was one skill he couldn't fake: riding a horse through deep snow while carrying a dead elk. The scene called for Jeremiah to haul his kill back to camp, and Pollack wanted it done in one continuous shot. No cuts, no tricks. Redford trained for days with the horse, building trust, learning its rhythms. Then came the day of the shoot. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. The snow was waist deep in places. The elk carcass weighed over 200 pounds, strapped across the horse's back. Redford mounted up, camera rolling, and guided the horse through drifts that could swallow a man whole. The horse stumbled twice. Redford nearly lost his grip once, but he kept going because stopping meant starting over. And in those mountains, starting over could mean losing daylight, losing the shot, losing everything. When they finally called cut, Redford's hands were numb, his face raw from windburn. But the take was perfect. One shot, one journey, no second chances. The movie's most haunting element wasn't in the script, it was the silence. Sidney Pollack made a decision early on that terrified the studio. He would let entire scenes play out without dialogue, without music, without anything but the sound of wind and snow. In one sequence, Jeremiah builds a cabin from scratch. No narration, no montage, just the methodical work of survival. Chopping logs, notching beams, stacking stones. It runs for nearly 10 minutes and nobody says a word. The studio executives watched the dailies and panicked. They called Pollack in for an emergency meeting. "This won't work," they said. Audiences will walk out. You need dialogue, you need music, you need something to fill the dead air. Pollock refused. He told them the silence was the point, that the emptiness of the wilderness was as much a character as Jeremiah himself, that modern audiences had forgotten what it felt like to sit with stillness. The executives pushed back harder. They threatened to recut the film themselves, add a voiceover, insert a traditional score. But Pollock had Robert Redford on his side, and Redford's contract gave him final cut approval. So the silence stayed. And when the film premiered, something extraordinary happened. Audiences didn't walk out. They leaned in. They listened to the wind. They heard what wasn't being said. Because sometimes the most powerful dialogue is the absence of words. Will Geer played Bear Claw Chris Lapp, the grizzled mountain man who teaches Jeremiah how to survive. But Geer almost didn't make it through filming. He was 69 years old, working in brutal conditions at high altitude, and nobody knew if his body could handle it. The first week of shooting, temperatures plunged below zero. The wind chill made it feel even colder. Geer's scenes required him to trudge through snowdrifts, wrestle props, and deliver lines while his beard froze solid. The crew watched him closely, worried he'd collapse. But Geer was tougher than anyone expected. He'd spent his youth as a botanist, hiking mountains and sleeping under stars. This wasn't Hollywood pretend for him. This was memory. Between takes, he'd tell stories about the Depression, about traveling the country on foot, about survival that had nothing to do with acting. The younger crew members listened in awe. Robert Redford called him the heart of the film, not just because of his performance, but because he carried something real into every scene, a kind of weathered wisdom that couldn't be faked. When they wrapped his final shot, Geer smiled through his frozen beard and said he'd do it all again, and meant it, because for 10 weeks in the mountains, Will Geer wasn't playing a character. He was living a life he'd once known. The film's visual beauty came at a cost nobody talks about. Cinematographer Duke Callahan shot the entire movie using natural light. No reflectors, no artificial fills, just the sun and snow and whatever the mountains gave him. It was a bold choice that created some of the most breathtaking images ever captured on film. But it also meant they were slaves to the weather. If clouds rolled in, they'd lose the shot. If the light changed too fast, they'd have to wait for the next day. And in the Utah Rockies in winter, the weather didn't care about shooting schedules. There were days when they'd hike for hours to reach a location, set up equipment, prepare the scene, and then watch as a storm moved in and killed the light. They'd pack everything up and hike back down with nothing to show for it. The studio executives back in Los Angeles were furious. They kept asking why it was taking so long, why they were burning through budget on weather delays. But Pollock knew what he had. He knew that every frame looked like a painting because they'd waited for perfection. And when you watch Jeremiah Johnson, when you see those mountains bathed in golden light or buried in blue shadow, you're seeing what patience looks like. What it costs to capture something true. The delays, the frozen fingers, the exhaustion. All of it was worth it for images that would last 50 years and beyond. One of the film's most powerful scenes involved a burial that nobody expected to be so devastating. Jeremiah discovers a woman and child frozen to death in the wilderness, victims of a harsh winter they couldn't survive. He digs graves in the frozen ground, a task that would break most men. The scene was scripted to be somber but straightforward. What happened instead shook the entire production. Robert Redford insisted on digging the graves himself. No stunt double, no tricks. The ground was frozen solid, making every strike of the shovel an act of pure force. The sound echoed across the valley, metal on ice, again and again. Take after take, Redford kept digging, sweat freezing on his face despite the cold. The crew fell silent. Some of them started crying behind the camera, because what they were watching wasn't acting anymore. It was grief made physical, a man alone in the world, burying strangers, knowing he could be next. When they finally called cut, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Sidney Pollock walked over to Redford, who was still standing in the hole he'd dug, breathing hard, hands bleeding. Pollock didn't say anything. He just nodded. Because sometimes a director knows when he's captured something that transcends the script, something raw and human and impossible to fake. That scene, more than any other, showed what Jeremiah Johnson was really about. Not revenge, not adventure, just the brutal, beautiful cost of survival. The iconic scene where Jeremiah raises his hand in farewell to Bear Claw wasn't planned. It happened spontaneously during a take, and it became one of the most memorable images in the film. But the story behind it reveals something deeper about how the movie came together. Will Geer and Robert Redford had developed a genuine bond during filming. Between takes, they'd sit together in the snow, barely talking, just existing in the cold. Geer taught Redford things you couldn't learn from a script: how to read weather, how to move through wilderness without fighting it, how to be still. And when it came time to film their final scene together, something unspoken passed between them. The script called for a simple parting, but as the cameras rolled, Redford turned back and raised his hand. Not a wave, just a raised palm, a gesture of respect, of gratitude, of goodbye. Geer, staying in character, raised his hand in return. The moment lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it carried the weight of everything they'd experienced together. Pollock saw it happen and knew immediately he'd keep it. Because you can't write that kind of truth. You can only be present when it arrives. Years later, that image became iconic. A man on horseback, hand raised against the mountains, acknowledging what he's learned and what he's leaving behind. All because 2 actors trusted each other enough to let go of the script. The Native American actors in the film brought authenticity the production desperately needed, but their involvement came with tension that simmered beneath every scene. The script required Crow warriors to be portrayed as antagonists, which made some Native consultants uncomfortable. They argued the story perpetuated stereotypes of indigenous people as savage obstacles to white settlement. Sidney Pollock listened and made changes. He worked with tribal advisors to ensure the Crow were shown as fully realized people, not cardboard villains. Their dialogue was spoken in actual Crow language, translated and coached by tribal members. Their clothing, weapons, and customs were researched and authenticated. But the central conflict remained. Jeremiah Johnson, a white man, versus the Crow Nation. During one particularly difficult scene, several Native actors walked off set. They felt the portrayal still carried too much weight toward the mountain man's perspective. Production halted for 2 days while Pollock met with tribal leaders and reworked the scene's framing. What emerged was a compromise. The Crow would be shown as warriors protecting their land, not as mindless aggressors. Jeremiah would be shown as an intruder who doesn't understand what he's triggering. The final film walks a careful line, trying to honor both the myth and the reality. It doesn't always succeed, but the effort was there, fought for in freezing tense and tense meetings. A reminder that every frame of film carries history, and not all of it is comfortable. The film's most dangerous stunt almost killed the stunt coordinator. A sequence called for a rider to gallop full speed through a narrow canyon pass while being chased. The ground was covered in ice hidden beneath fresh snow, making every step treacherous. The stunt coordinator decided to do the ride himself rather than risk anyone else. He'd been doing stunts for 20 years and thought he knew the risks. But the mountains don't care about experience. Midway through the gallop, the horse hit a patch of ice and went down hard. The rider was thrown 15 feet, landing on frozen rocks. The crew rushed over, certain they'd find him dead or paralyzed. Instead, he stood up, checked himself over, and asked if they got the shot. They hadn't. The camera had been positioned wrong, so he climbed back on a different horse and did it again. This time, the horse stayed upright. When they reviewed the footage later, you could see how close it came to disaster. The horse's hooves slipping, the rider adjusting his weight at the last second, the whole thing balanced on a knife's edge between spectacular and catastrophic. Sidney Pollock watched the footage and made a decision. He cut the stunt from the film. "Too dangerous," he said. "Not worth risking lives for a few seconds of action." The stunt coordinator was furious, but Pollock held firm. Because Jeremiah Johnson was about survival, not spectacle, and he wasn't going to let anyone die to prove that point. The film's most surreal moment came from a man who wasn't supposed to be there. During a break in filming, an older man appeared at the edge of camp. He was dressed in buckskins, carrying a rifle, and looked like he'd walked straight out of 1850. Nobody knew who he was or how he'd found them in the middle of nowhere. He introduced himself as a trapper who'd lived in these mountains for 40 years. He'd heard they were making a movie about mountain men and came to watch. Sidney Pollock invited him to stay, figuring he might offer useful insights. What Happened next was extraordinary. The man watched them film a trapping scene and shook his head. "That's not how you set a beaver trap," he said. "Let me show you." He walked onto the frozen stream, knelt down, and demonstrated the proper technique with his bare hands in ice water. The crew filmed it. Then he corrected their fire starting method, their way of skinning game, even how they walked through deep snow. For 3 days, he lived on set, teaching Robert Redford things no acting coach could. When filming wrapped that location, he disappeared back into the mountains without saying goodbye. Nobody ever learned his real name, but his fingerprints are all over the film's authenticity. A ghost from another century, making sure they got it right. The scene where Jeremiah eats dinner with a Flathead family became one of the film's most touching moments, but it nearly caused a cultural disaster. The script called for a traditional meal shared in silence, a gesture of peace and hospitality, but the production team didn't know the specific protocols of Flathead dining customs. They guessed, using generic research about Native American traditions, piecing together what they thought looked authentic. They arranged the set, positioned the actors, laid out the food, and called everyone to their marks. Then the cameras started rolling. But before Pollock could call action, the native consultants rushed onto the set, waving their hands, voices urgent. "Stop! Stop everything!" When the crew asked what was wrong, the advisors looked genuinely distressed. What they had arranged wasn't a dinner. It was a mourning ritual. The crew had accidentally staged a funeral feast, complete with specific placements that honored the dead. If they'd filmed it, they would have insulted an entire culture on camera, preserving the mistake forever on film. The production ground to a halt. The Flathead advisors didn't just point out the error, they sat down with the entire crew and taught them properly, where people sat in relation to the fire, how food was offered and received, what gestures meant welcome versus what signaled grief. The hand positions, the eye contact, even the silence had rules. The production delayed for a full day while they relearned everything from scratch. Props were rearranged, blocking was redesigned. Actors rehearsed the correct customs until they became natural. When they finally shot the scene properly, everything changed. The stiffness disappeared. What could have been a stereotype became something genuine, earned through humility. The Flathead actors relaxed, knowing their culture was being represented truthfully. And the dinner scene, when it appeared on screen, carried a weight of authenticity that audiences could feel even without understanding why. Robert Redford later said, "That moment taught him more about listening than any acting class." Because respect isn't something you perform, it's something you earn by admitting what you don't know. And sometimes the most important direction comes from knowing when to stop. The movie's score almost didn't exist. Composer Tim McIntyre initially wrote a traditional Western soundtrack, full of sweeping strings and heroic themes. Big orchestral moments that swelled during key scenes, exactly what Hollywood expected. He delivered it proudly, certain he'd nailed the assignment. Sidney Pollack listened once and rejected it completely. Not just rejected it. He told McIntyre to throw it all away and start over. Pollack wanted something stranger, something that felt like the mountains themselves, not music about the wilderness, music from the wilderness. McIntyre went back to his studio, frustrated and confused. For weeks, he experimented with sounds that had no place in a movie theater. He used mostly wind instruments and percussion, sounds that could have existed in the 1850s. Flutes made from wood, drums stretched with animal hide. No orchestra, no modern production tricks. Just raw, elemental music that felt carved from stone, weathered by wind. He brought it to Pollack, nervous it was too strange, too uncommercial. Pollack loved it immediately. But the studio executives hated it. They sat through the temp screening in stony silence, then demanded a conventional score. Something audiences would recognize as movie music, something safe, something that sounded like every other Western they'd ever released. Pollack fought back hard, arguing that conventional music would destroy the film's authenticity, that putting a symphony orchestra over images of solitude would be a lie. The battle went on for weeks, memos flying back and forth, threats of firing, threats of quitting, until they reached an exhausted compromise. McIntyre would score key emotional moments traditionally, giving the studio their familiar beats. But the rest would stay sparse and strange, trusting the audience to sit with the unfamiliar. What resulted was a hybrid that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Moments of beauty and silence punctuated by music that felt both ancient and new. sounds that could have been wind through canyon walls or human breath across a flute. The score became as much a part of the landscape as the mountains themselves, not background noise, but weather. Robert Redford's most difficult day on set had nothing to do with the cold or the stunts. It was the scene where Jeremiah finds his murdered family. The script gave minimal direction, just emotional devastation captured in silence. Redford spent the morning before filming alone, walking through the snow, preparing himself mentally. When the cameras rolled, something broke inside him. The grief wasn't acted. It was channeled from somewhere real, somewhere personal. He knelt in the snow for 20 minutes while the camera watched. No dialogue, no music, just a man's face showing what words couldn't express. Sidney Pollack never yelled cut. He just let it happen. When Redford finally stood up, he walked away from set and didn't return for 3 hours. The crew gave him space, understanding they had witnessed something raw. That single take made it into the film unchanged, and audiences felt it. They felt the weight of loss transmitted through complete silence. Because sometimes the most powerful performances come from the places actors don't want to go. The film's ending, where Jeremiah rides past the Crow warrior who nods in respect, was debated until the final cut. Some wanted a violent confrontation. Others wanted verbal reconciliation. Pollack wanted neither. He wanted a moment that transcended revenge, that showed two warriors acknowledging each other across an impossible divide. The scene was shot in a single afternoon with minimal rehearsal. The Crow actor, Joaquin Martinez, suggested the nod should be almost imperceptible, not a gesture of friendship, but of understanding. Redford agreed. When they filmed it, the exchange lasted maybe 2 seconds. A glance, a slight nod, then riding on. The studio executives wanted it reshot with more drama, more resolution. But Pollack refused. That ambiguous moment, he argued, was the entire point of the film. Not every conflict ends in victory or defeat. Sometimes it just ends, and the survivors keep moving. The studio backed down, and that quiet nod became one of cinema's most debated endings. What does it mean? Forgiveness? Respect? Exhaustion? The answer is yes. All of it. Everything that can't be spoken. During post-production, the editors discovered a problem. They'd shot hundreds of hours of footage in the wilderness, but much of it looked too beautiful, too pristine. It didn't feel lived in or dangerous. So, they made a radical decision. They degraded the film intentionally, adding grain, muting colors slightly, making it look older and rougher. The process was painstaking, done frame by frame in the lab. They wanted it to feel like a photograph from the 1800s, something discovered in an attic. The technique worked almost too well. When test audiences saw the film, some asked if it was actually shot in the 1970s or if they'd found old footage. The weathered look became part of the film's identity, making the past feel present and immediate. It wasn't historical recreation, it was time travel. Will Geer's final line in the film was improvised. The script had him saying a traditional goodbye, something formal and proper. A farewell that felt written, polished, safe. Geer read it during rehearsals and hated it. He told Pollack it was too stiff, too Hollywood. Bear Claw wouldn't talk like that. A man who'd spent decades alone in the mountains wouldn't waste words on ceremony. He'd say something true, or he'd say nothing at all. Pollack told him to stick with the script anyway. They'd worked too hard on every word to start changing things now, but Geer couldn't let it go. He kept thinking about it between takes, rolling different phrases around in his mind, searching for something that felt real. So when the cameras rolled for the final take, he made a choice. He threw out the scripted line completely and said something else. Something simpler and more profound. The words became iconic, quoted for decades. But what's remarkable is that Robert Redford didn't know the change was coming. They hadn't discussed it. Geer hadn't warned him. His reaction on screen is genuine surprise, caught in the moment. You can see it in his eyes, the slight pause, the way he processes what he's just heard. It's not acting. It's a man responding to something unexpected and true. Sidney Pollack watched it happen from behind the camera and immediately knew what he had. He loved it so much he kept the take, and that spontaneous exchange became the emotional core of their entire relationship. Two men in the wilderness saying goodbye in a way that mattered. Because sometimes the best writing happens when actors trust each other enough to abandon the script, when they stop performing and start listening. The film quietly revolutionized how Westerns were made. Before Jeremiah Johnson, the genre relied on action, shootouts, and clear moral lines. After Jeremiah Johnson, filmmakers realized you could strip away everything except landscape and silence and still tell a powerful story. Directors like Terrence Malick and Cormac McCarthy cited it as inspiration. The slow cinema movement owes it a debt. Even modern survival films echo its techniques, not because they're copying it, but because it proves something essential. That emptiness on screen doesn't bore audiences. It invites them in. And sometimes the most gripping drama is watching a man simply exist in a world that doesn't care. Robert Redford never watched the finished film. Even after it became a cult classic, even after decades of praise, he refused to sit through it. In interviews, he said watching himself on screen always felt uncomfortable, but Jeremiah Johnson was different. It was too personal. He'd left too much of himself in those mountains. Watching it would mean confronting things he'd rather keep buried. The crew understood, because they'd all felt it. The film wasn't entertainment for them. It was an experience that changed them. And some experiences you don't revisit, you just carry them forward. The movie bombed initially. Critics were divided, audiences stayed away, and Warner Brothers considered it a financial disappointment. But something strange happened over the years. It kept getting discovered. Cable television aired it constantly. VHS sales exceeded expectations. And slowly, quietly, it became one of the most beloved Westerns ever made. Not through marketing or awards, but through word of mouth. People who found it told others, and those people told others, until it became what it was always meant to be. Not a blockbuster, a legend. After filming wrapped, Robert Redford kept one prop, a knife that Jeremiah carries throughout the film. He took it home and mounted it on his wall in Utah. For years, visitors would ask about it, and he'd tell them stories from the shoot. The cold, the silence, the mountains that almost killed them. And then he'd go quiet, staring at the knife like it held memories he couldn't quite articulate. Because Jeremiah Johnson wasn't just a role, it was a transformation, and that knife was proof he'd survived it. The film didn't chase perfection, it chased truth, and found it in the last place Hollywood usually looks: silence, snow, and a man learning to disappear. If this journey moved you, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what moment still haunts you. Thanks for watching, and remember, some stories aren't told with words, they're told with mountains.